All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here and joining on this platform. And thanks to Aditya and his team at AIWMI for organizing this event. I understand this is one of the or the first of the series of masterclasses being arranged by AIWMI ahead of the event on the 6th, which is the main event. Thanks everyone once again for being here. And my background has already been given by Aditya, so I wouldn't like to speak much about myself. But just to mention that yes, we have been associated with AIWMI for many years now, and I had the opportunity to also host a similar kind of masterclass a couple of years back at Ahmedabad. So good to be here again on this new platform and be speaking to you. So before starting the session, maybe I think what, given the current scenario, I think everyone is aware what our economy and the country, what we're going through. Maybe if we can, take a pause of 10 seconds, just close our eyes and offer our prayer, because I believe that collective prayers do magic. So if we can just take a pause for 10 seconds and then begin our session. All right. So starting with the session now. So I'll be covering, as Aditya mentioned, the theme for the masterclass is really to talk about the AF registration broadly, and also talk about some of the structuring challenges and governance issues and gray areas. So I want to make it this session as wholesome as possible from my end and share my insights and my experiences in my practice area so far. And then we can towards the end of the session we will have question answer session depending upon what time permits. So, just going by the basics and the elementary stuff here, clearly the definition of the AIF. Now, AIF is purely a privately pooled vehicle, so to speak. And the only comparative that you can draw here is maybe an NBFC or, a venture capital fund, which was the prior animal, so to speak. The AIF regulations replaced in 2012. There are other obviously private vehicles like private trusts and LLPs who are in operation, but obviously we can't be talking about those. We are talking about the regulatory space here. So if we have to talk about what can be done privately in terms of pooling monies of private individuals, institutions, then AIF is the best suited animal. And I think the recent past, the kind of developments that have happened in the banking industry and in the NBFC arena has highlighted the importance of AIFs all the more as being the viable mode of alternate funding for the industry, which has kind of being left high and dry because of lack of finance for the venture capital and for the startup industry. So an AIF can be set up broadly in three forms, legal forms: company, LLP, or a trust. And so there are clearly exemptions to it, because you can have family trust, you can have ESOP trust, you can have holding companies, and you can have securitization trusts, which are also kind of in some form, in fashion, a pooling vehicle. But they are set up for certain specific purposes, or they are either regulated by some regulatory authority. Talking specifically about employee welfare trust, it's a very beautiful animal, so to speak, because in an AF parlance, clearly that's one method in which you can actually create a ESOP trust for the employees of the manager, whereby there can be a vesting schedule. They can participate in the profits of the fund depending upon how long they are with the AIF. So that can be structured, and we'll come to that in the next few slides. But I thought I'll just highlight this, that employee welfare trust, although it's an exemption, I think we have to take care that how we structure in terms of who are the beneficiaries of this EWT from AIF point of view, because as the name suggests, it's a welfare trust created for the employee, and the employees of the IM should ideally be the beneficiaries and not third parties. We'll touch upon this aspect again in next slides. So broadly talking about what are the aspects or the features for each of these legal forms, and what drives the decision making for a sponsor of the AIF. If you see, I mean, I can just jump to the last point here, the last row here. If you see the number of AIFs that are registered, 743 as of 2nd of May 2021, and of those, 726 are set up as trusts, 2 as company and 15 as LLP. I mean, that just goes to show how that bias is towards trust. And purely, I would say this is from the point of view of ease of setup. You don't have to go through the whole rigmarole of going through the ROC route to set up the legal form there. You just have to, present yourself. And the settler has to go to the sub registrar's office and execute the trust. That's about it. And there are a whole host of this professional third-party trustee services, service providers who are happy to act as trustee to such trusts. So that way, it's more, I think, become like a norm rather than like a default thing for anyone wanting to set up a AIF. That's one. And second being the client confidentiality, because the trust document per se does not contain the names of beneficiaries, unlike in case of a company, for example, or even in case of LLP to some extent. Now, the names of the partners in LLP can be known on the MCA website, or even the names of the companies can be obtained. But nothing of that sort can ever happen in the case of trust, because you never mention the name of beneficiaries in the trust document. Except for maybe, I think, to some extent, category 3 for whatever tax nuances. Some of these category 3 AIFs may still want to mention the name of beneficiaries. But I think, largely speaking, for Cat 1 and Cat 2 AIFs, the names of beneficiaries are generally not mentioned. Now, ease of operations, obviously, I think it's very high, because as I said, any amendments to be done to the trust, it can happen in a couple of days' time, unlike in the case of a company or LLP. And I think it's, as I said, it's acceptable kind of a form, purely from marketability point of view, right? In terms of the appetite of investors, the distributors in the market understand the trust format very well that way. And again, maybe purely from the developments that have happened in the last 3-4 years, purely from a GST point of view, the GST on the management fee is a significant, sunk cost for the fund that way. Which is where the LLP structure has gathered some interest, at least to the extent the category 3 AIF is concerned. And we at ICUL were one of the first ones to actually set up a category 3 open-end fund in LLP format, exactly for these tax reasons. So, given that the GST is an issue, I think we may see in times to come LLP being used as a viable form to set up an AIF. Okay, so this is broadly how, if it is a trust, since a trust is a favorite legal form, so we have just presented a typical structure as to how it will look like if the AIF is formed as a trust. Then you have a trustee, which would be either an in-house or a third-party trustee entity, which will have a investment management agreement with the investment manager entity, and there will be a sponsor entity. Now, the sponsor and the manager can be the same entity. It need not be that different. We have presented it this way just for the ease of understanding. You have investors coming from India as well as from outside of India. I'll come to that in a bit when we talk about FDI norms. Then you have, I mentioned to you about employees welfare trust, right, where you can have the carry distribution being made to the EWT, and the beneficiaries of the EWT would be the employees of the manager entity. So broadly, this is how it would be typically. So moving further. Broad points to think about when we talk about which category to choose, because that's one decision maker for anyone looking at setting up an AIF. Between Cat 1 and Cat 2, I think it's largely fungible, except for Angel Fund, which is slightly a different animal. But otherwise, if you talk about venture capital funds, SME funds, social venture funds, and infrastructure funds, between these 4 categories and the residual category, which is the category 2 AIF, you can switch between the two depending upon what is the ask from your target audience investors. But broadly speaking, what we have seen in category 2 AIF, it's largely a VC or a PE fund setting up a category 2 AIF, or a structured credit fund, or a mezz debt fund, or a real estate fund being the strategy. For category 1, the angel fund is a slightly different animal, so to speak, because that's one AIF where you can actually have a depool structure. When I say depool structure, I mean to say that you can have segregated portfolios for identified investors in the fund. But for all other AIFs, it has to be a blind pool by definition. There are no exceptions to it. There is one exception. We'll come to it. It's about excuse investors, but other than that, the blind pool is across the board. You can't have segregated portfolio in either of the AIFs. Category 3 AIF is largely geared towards hedge fund strategy or long only, long short funds, where you are largely looking at investment, making investments in cash market or public markets that way. The SEBI registration fee is also again kind of graded. So category 1, it's 5 lakh, then 10 lakh and 15 lakh being the registration fee. The application fee is standard 1 lakh for all the three categories. For angel fund, the registration fee is a small amount of 2 lakhs. Now, continuing interest by the sponsor and manager. This is very important purely from a skin in the game point of view, that the sponsor has some economic interest in running the show. And I don't know if people are tracking what's been happening even on the mutual fund space. Last week only, there was this new circular where SEBI has now mandated that 20% of the compensation to be paid to key personnel of the mutual fund have to be by way of issuance of units of that mutual fund scheme, of the mutual fund schemes. So the idea is clearly that there has to be an alignment of economic interest. I think that's now actually percolated even in the retail space now, but this is already there so far as the AIF is concerned. So I'm just trying to draw a parallel there. The ticket size there is 2.5% of the corpus, or rupees 5 crore, whichever is low. This is for both Cat 1 and Cat 2. For Cat 3, it's a higher threshold of 5% of the corpus, or 10 crore, whichever is low. Uh, Now, ability to invest in listed securities, it's there for category 3F, as I said, purely because the strategy that you can launch in category 3F is geared towards cash market and public markets that way, and derivatives to some extent. But when it comes to Cat 1, then you are largely restricted because it is not a favorite, so to speak, legal form or a category to do a listed investment. Coming to category 2 AIF, definitely you can do a significant amount compared to category 1, where you can go up to 49.99% of your corpus technically into listed space. Now, this is something purely, I think it just makes sense for fund managers to think about this category purely because it gives liquidity, so to speak. Because if you're investing almost a significant portion, or almost a half of the corpus in listed, and your strategy allows you to make this type of listed investments, then that affords you liquidity purely from that point of view. If you look at overall restrictions and compliances, I think across the three categories, it's largely the same. Not much of a difference, but yes, if I have to see the compliance level in terms of category 3 AIFs who want to leverage, then there is a 2x amount, which means that the amount of leverage that can go is only 2 times of the NAV of category 3 AIF. The restrictions are very much limited or not at all there if I have to compare it with category 1 for category 2. The category 2 almost has the area open for them to decide what strategy they want to launch. As I said, the only limitation is that the investments by category 2 have to principally into unlisted securities, which means 51% of or technically 50.1% of the funds corpus should be into unlisted security, and there is no compulsion on what strategy can be launched for category 2 AIF. For category 1, as I said, there are these subcategories under which you have to seek registration. So depending upon the nuances of your strategy, you may have to decide between a venture capital fund or a SME fund or an infra fund. So you will have to then decide which of the subcategories you want to apply for. And as I said, even where you want to do a venture capital strategy, you can launch it very well in a category 2 AIF rather than being restricted in the category 1 AIF. Because for a venture capital fund, again, there is 2/3, 1/3 norm, which means that 2/3 has to be into equity and equity linked instruments, and only 1/3 can be into debt or by way of an IP or thereabouts. So, so I think, I mean, I'm not getting into too much of technicalities of each of these subcategories because it will take too much of time. We need to devote time on other stuff also. So I'm just giving you broad categorization here on the screen. And happy to take questions later on any of these points. Going further, so QIB status has been granted to all the three categories, and that's the reason. That's actually one of the reasons why this is very much favorite so far as Category 3 AIF is concerned. Because if you are looking at investing into IPOs, then if you are able to pool money from private investors and get that QIB status, you get a higher allocation in any IPO that way. So purely for an IPO-driven strategy for Category 3 AIF, or even for Category 2 AIF, to the extent of the limit that is permissible, the QIB status works wonderful there. Leverage is not possible for Category 1, Category 2, quite understandably, because you don't want to create a NBFC kind of a parallel structure here, where there could be arbitrage and all. But for Category 3, yes, as I said, 2x leverage is possible, because if you are looking at doing a long short strategy or derivative strategy along with cash, you can go up to 2x of the NAV. Investment is permitted. So, as I said earlier on, in domestic investors and foreign investors are allowed to invest in AIF under the FDI route. Even foreign DFIs can invest. And the recent notification by the government of India, even pension funds, private pension funds are also allowed. So that opens up a very good or a sizable chunk of corpus to be kind of now channeled into AIF space. Insurance companies and banks have already been allowed for a few years now, so that's not a new development there. But all of these generally don't invest, are not permitted to invest in Category 3 AIF. They can invest either in Category 1 or Category 2. Diversification norm purely from point of view of managing the risk at the AIF level. Now this is, I would say, the basic threshold. You can have a higher threshold also if you want to, but the basic threshold that has been put by the regulations is that not more than 25% of the fund's corpus can be invested in a single investee entity for Category 1 and Category 2. For Category 3, this threshold comes down to 10% of the investable funds. And investable funds broadly means the corpus amount less the estimated expenditure of the fund. So if you have a corpus of say 100 crores and the estimated tenure for the fund is say 8 years, and you estimate the fees for the 8 years, maybe I think fees and expenses, then assuming that you leave aside 15 crores, then you are left with 85 crores as investable funds. So 25% of that, and not 25% of 100 crores. Category 1 and Category 2 AIF compulsorily have to be closed-ended, which means that you have to define the term or the tenure of the fund upfront in your fund documents. You can't keep them open-ended. Category 3 can either be open-end or closed-end. Open-end would mean that there is no definite life to it. You have continuous redemptions and subscriptions on a periodic basis, and that's how it would be. Now, each AIF is required to have a corpus of 20 crores. What this means essentially is that you can't have your first closing, unless you achieve this magic target of 20 crores. Only once you have raised corpus of 20 crores that you are allowed to, declare a first close, technically speaking. This limit is brought down to 5 crores for an angel fund. Each investor is required to put in minimum of 1 crore in the AIF, and this is 25 lakhs for the angel fund. Now, this 1 crore can, in certain situations where there are joint investors who are investing in certain relationship, for example, whether it's spouses or a parent and a child or something, then that is allowed. So they can invest jointly, and that they can invest in whatever proportion interest. It could be 25 lakhs, 75 lakhs, 50 lakhs, 50 lakhs each, and that combined could be 1 crore. So there it's not a requirement to bring in 1 crore each. But if it's any other relationship or two unrelated people coming together but investing jointly, then each of them is required to put minimum of 1 crore. Employee of the manager participating or who wants to make a positive investment in the fund, he is not required to bring in 1 crore. He can just put 25 lakhs, and that is the relaxation granted by SEBI. to only the employees and directors of the manager of the AIF. However, if an employee wants to participate in carry units, we talked about the employee welfare trust ahead earlier on. So if the carry units are to be issued directly to the employees of the manager, then there is no need for the employees of the manager, whosoever are the recipients or the designated recipients for the carry, to invest anything. They can just subscribe to the units, or they may be offered units free of cost. The limit on the investors is 1,000. So the moment you have 1,000 investors, and this is usually not an issue for Cat 1 and Cat 2, but maybe for, so to speak, retail category 3 AIFs, where if they reach this significant amount of investors, then they perhaps may have to look at launching a successor scheme or a follow-on scheme. They can't accept more than 100 investors, and it's 200 investors for an angel fund. The minimum tenure. So the tenure for, as I said, category 1 and category 2 have to be closed-ended compulsorily, and they have to have a definite term, and that term cannot be less than 3 years. It has to be at least 3 years. But I mean, we as lawyers, we always tell our clients to have, even if they look at any product, generally it can't be, because you're talking about unlisted space investment. It can't be 3 years. But yeah, there have been situations where we have seen term being kept as 5 years or thereabouts for whatever strategic reasons. For angel funds, the term is maximum of 5 years. Now, coming to the eligibility criteria, I'll just quickly go through, I think pretty much standard there. Purely the trust, so the trust deed has to be executed before you make an application to SEBI. It's a 2 days affair. You go to, the settler has to visit the sub-registrar's office one fine day and just execute the trust deed. Once that is in place, you have to make a self-registration on the SEBI portal by paying 1 lakh application fee, and then you receive the login and password, and you go ahead and make an submission towards the application. Coming back to the basic requirements, so obviously this is a privately pooled entity. You can't be making any public announcements, or you can't be making you can say public media or use social media towards marketing your fund that way. It has to be a very one-to-one kind of an affair, where you approach target investors on a one-to-one basis. There will be a fit and proper check on the sponsor and the manager, purely from the fitment point of view, which all intermediaries have to go through. The basic requirement from a key investment point of view here is that the person has to have at least 5 years of experience and a relevant qualification. Relevant qualification generally means someone who has worked in a asset management space, or acted as a fund manager or a portfolio manager. And recently there has been a change where earlier, up till last year, both these requirements were like the 5 years of experience and qualification were required to be complied by a single key person. But now it has been divided. So SEBI is okay, whereby you have 2 key persons, one fulfilling the 5 years of relevant experience criteria, and the other personnel having the relevant qualification. Relevant qualification generally means someone who is a CFA, or someone who is a MBA finance, or a CA by profession. Largely, that's how it's been. You need to define your investment objective, strategy, proposed corpus, tenure, target investors. And now SEBI has also, since last year, SEBI has also come out with standardized PPM template, so to speak, for each of the categories of AIF. So you have to follow that template while you are preparing your PPM, because along with the application that you make to SEBI, you have to file the PPM as well. So that PPM has to be in compliance with the template that SEBI has come out with. Generally, the process takes anywhere between 2 to 4 months, given the current scenario that we are into. Now, there are purely from now, I'm just touching upon some of the key governance aspects as to, because it's not open for the manager to, carry out certain actions on its own without taking into account, investor vote in certain matters. Now, these are the threshold, like 3/4 majority and 2/3 majority that I've mentioned on the screen, are actually coming purely from the regulations. So it is still open for the manager to set out any other matter that he thinks where purely from a governance and from a transparency point of view, he wants to consult investors. But broadly, these are when we talk about winding up of the fund, or we're talking about valuation being done on an annual basis rather than on a 6 monthly basis, or in specie distribution, or investment by the fund in an associate, or any material change, then you would need that 75% investor approval that way to go ahead with any of these items. The items requiring two-third vote, and this is in value terms, right? So it's not really in the number of investor terms, but how much of value investors are carrying in terms of that the voting is to be counted. So the extension of the term of the fund and approval of approving any material change to the investment strategy. These are the two items that require two-third majority of investors in value terms. Now, the extension of the term can be only up to 2 years. So if assuming in the PPM you have mentioned that the tenure is 8 years, then the maximum extension that you can take by taking two-third investor vote can be by up to 2 years. Material change in the investment strategy. Now, this is slightly a debatable point because one can take a call here that this is not a change in fundamental attribute, because that is also a widely defined term in one of the SEBI circulars, that if any change in the fundamental attribute is being made, then an exit option is to be given. But I think to the extent that we are talking about changes in the strategy, I think we can stick to this requirement and just take two-third approval. And once that is there, that's good enough to implement the change. There was also a new change that was implemented since last year. This is for the experienced fund managers, where while they're launching new funds, they tend to mention performance about prior funds that they have been managing, or they are either closed or they are still up and running. So the requirement from SEBI there is that to show the performance in certain format. I mentioned to you that the SEBI has come out with standardized PPM format. So in the format itself, SEBI has mentioned, has given a table in which the performance of prior funds is to be shown. The other requirement is to also make sure that you show or you compare that performance with the recent benchmarking report that is applicable to the category of AIF that you're talking about. And we have seen SEBI also insisting upon attaching the benchmarking report to the PPM purely from a transparency point of view, and not requiring the reader of the PPM to actually go to the CRISIL website and download the benchmarking report. So we have seen that query coming from SEBI quite often. Another significant change that happened last year was with regard to this, investment committee. Now, up till October of last year, there was never an issue on the composition of investment committee and whether the investment committee has to be a decision maker or it can just be a recommendatory body. But come October 2020, there was this amendment that happened, whereby the basic takeaway from that amendment was that if you are having an investment committee or any other body for that matter, which is decision making or making decisions for the investments and divestments of the fund, then each and every member of such body or IC will be equally responsible along with the manager. Now, this raised eyebrows within the industry purely because some of the large LPs always would have one or the other nominee sitting on the IC or such LPAC committee. So the question was then that what about the liability issues? And there was a lot of, I would say, discussion within the industry and discussions happened with SEBI as well, as we understand, because of which certain exceptions were granted. One exception to the rule was that if you have investors, all the investors, right, other than the manager and sponsor, who have invested at least 70 crores into the fund each, and they agreed to give a waiver in writing that they are sophisticated enough to understand the risks of investing into the AIF, then the members of IC of such an AIF shall not be responsible along with the manager, and it will just be the manager who will be taking up all the risks so far as the investment decisions go. Now, this exception is obviously limited to a significant ticket size we're talking about, and may not be applicable to a large number of AIFs in the market currently operating. but that's how it is presently. And second point to understand is that if you are having an external member, and when I say external member, he is not an employee of the manager on the given date, and he has been invited as a market expert or a professional member or a strategic member to give advice to the IC or to the manager on the investments that are being proposed by the fund. Then as long as he is a resident Indian citizen, there is not an issue. But if he is a not a resident Indian citizen, then and you are making an application to SEBI, and at that point in time, that person has been mentioned in the PPM as an external member who is not resident Indian citizen, then SEBI is likely not to process your application, because there's already a circular where SEBI has clarified that such application will be put on hold because SEBI is internally checking with Government of India on the stance, as well as with RBI on their stance, where such external members who are not resident Indian citizen can play an arbitrage, because there is this Schedule 8 of FEMA non-debt rules, whereby if you are if the sponsor and manager or manager entity is owned and controlled by non-residents, then to that extent FDI norms are applicable. Now, since if the IC is also decision making body, and you have significant, or even if one person is an external member and he is having a say in the investment decision making process, whether there has to be any kind of comparison between the rule under Schedule 8 of non-debt rules and what has been presented in the AIF regulation. So I think that's what SEBI is awaiting clarification from the government, but one has to be mindful that their application will be placed on hold till the time there is clarity. One other significant point is that if there's an external member mentioned in the PPM who is also part of the IC, and if there are any changes to be made, then you have to take 75% investor approval, super majority approval, to make any change, whether it's an induction or a removal of the external member of such an IC. So this was a new change that came last year. This is purely from bringing more transparency and governance and accountability in the AIF space, and also to make sure that there is no outsourcing of investment decision making by the manager. Obviously, I think it's a settled rule that the manager and the sponsor are acting in a fiduciary capacity. So it's like, acting in utmost good faith in all their dealings, and being transparent and managing conflict of interest and disclosing such conflicts as and when they arise. There are a few items where you need to go to SEBI. One of the items is change in control of the manager, and change in control would also mean change in legal form. So if you are set up as a LLP and you're changing from LLP to a private company, then in that scenario also you have to go to SEBI and take prior approval. People often confuse that change in control only means change in the ownership, but no, even if there's a change in the legal form, you still have to go to SEBI and take approval. Co-investment is permitted by the manager and sponsor, but it can't be on terms favorable than those offered to the AIF. A custodian is required to be appointed only if the corpus is more than 500 crores, but it is compulsory for category 3 AIF. Compulsorily required to disclose the financial information about portfolio entities within 180 days of the end of the financial year. The valuation for category 1 and category 2 AIF is to be carried out by default once in every 6 months by an independent valuer. As I said earlier on, you can take investor approval and extend this valuation period from 6 months to an annual affair. A category 3 AIF is required to disclose NAV each quarter if it's a closed-ended fund, and monthly if it's an open-ended fund. Last year, another change that happened was with regard to stewardship code. Now, this is obviously across the board. If you would have been aware, IRDA, PFRDA, RBI, each of these regulators have adopted this stewardship code for their respective industry. Even SEBI was not left out. So SEBI has also come out with this requirement that if you are investing into listed securities, then the AIF is required to adopt the stewardship code. Principally, it talks about how there will be participation by the AIF as an institutional investor in the decision-making process of the investee entity, and what would be the voting policy, and so that would be the detailing that would be required to be done in the stewardship code. Now, reporting to SEBI, obviously, you are as a any category of AIF, you're required to file a quarterly report. Right now, it is 7 days of the end of the quarter, but it's going to change to 10 days from the December quarter of this year. Category 3F again will be required to file quarterly from this December quarter onwards. Right now it's monthly. I mean to say category 3F that undertakes leverage. Otherwise, it is still has to do on a quarterly basis. But from December quarter onwards, irrespective whether a category 3F is undertaking leverage or not, it will be required to file on a quarterly basis only. And these are reports to be filed electronically, not in physical form. Compliance test report obviously is to be submitted by the manager with the trustee and then to be shared with SEBI to show if there's any non-compliance and what corrective steps have been taken. Another significant change that happened last year was with regard to audit of the compliance with the terms of the PPM. This report is required to be filed within 6 months from the end of the financial year with the trustee, with the manager, and with SEBI. So I think it's very significant step by SEBI, and one has to be very much aware of what the terms of the PPM are and how the operations of the AIF are being carried out that way. Now, I'll be touching upon some of the gray areas or some of the discussion points that generally happen when we discuss setting up an AIF with our potential clients. I'll just quickly go through some of the key ones now. One is obviously whether you have to have a one trust, one scheme or one trust, multiple schemes. Now it's a discussion that you ideally should have with your target investors. But if there is no such discussion and you just need to first set up a trust, then the advice is to set up the trust in an umbrella trust format, which gives you an ability to launch multiple schemes. There are not many test cases other than tax area, whereby the ring fencing aspect has been tested purely from a contract point of view or purely from any other applicable law point of view other than tax. Because purely from a tax point of view, as you know, category 1 and category 2 have been granted automatic tax pass through, which means that the investors have to individually pay or discharge their taxes, and no taxes are paid at the trust level except the withholding that is required. For category 3, there is no automatic tax pass through, which is where this ring fencing issue would come to the play, that whether you have to have a one trust, one scheme approach or one trust, multiple scheme approach for a category 3 IF. Although to some extent, this can be mitigated because you can apply for PAN for each scheme. And then if each scheme is shown as a separate assessee, to that extent, even that issue can be mitigated to some extent. We discussed about AIF vehicle, whether it has to be trust versus LLP. Companies almost ruled out because just a couple of AIFs being set up as in a company format. We talked about blind pool concept ahead on. The only exception to this is the excused investor, and to some extent even a defaulting contributor, because even he may not be offered the profits of the entire portfolio, so to speak. So even a defaulting contributor can be an exception to the blind pool, but by default or the acceptable norm in terms of exception to the blind pool has been the excused investor. Even SEBI has accepted this, although with certain checks and balances. It can't be that someone just out of the blue says that he doesn't want to invest in a particular investment proposed by the fund. The investor has to upfront tell the manager as to what are his handicaps or whether he has been prevented by the law or the constitution document that under which he set up from making certain investment. The best example here is that insurance companies, right? Insurance companies can't make investment in private companies or in LLPs, or they can't make investment in foreign securities. So those are the typical ones who are generally the excused investors. AIFs can't give loan because then that becomes an arbitrage between an AIF structure and an NBFC structure, right? So a loan can only be given by an NBFC and not by an AIF. It has also been clarified by SEBI in one of their FAQs. Any debt investment is possible, obviously. So a loan structured as a debt security can definitely happen, but a pure play loan can't happen. So there was another discussion point way back in 2018, early on, where the Ministry of Finance came out with a press release to say that if any entity has received FDI and that entity is operating in an unregulated activity or is not registered or is exempted from registration, then such entity which receives FDI has to follow certain capitalization norms, and that went as high as 20 million to as low as 2 million, depending upon whether it's a fund-based activity or non-fund-based activity. To which there was then clarification issued by SEBI to say that there is significant oversight upon the investment manager and the sponsor under the AIF regulations, and purely from that point of view, they can't be considered to be unregulated, although they are not directly licensed with SEBI. So that was a comfort given by SEBI to the industry to that extent. The bottom line is that the manager and sponsor entity can have FDI and not be subjected to those 2 million, 20 million capitalization norms. Coming to the key issues, okay, we can talk about the co-investments. Now, co-investment as a class, while in between, I think there were some lucky ones who got through their structure whereby they were able to launch or they were able to provide for launching co-investment class as part of their AI structure. SEBI has stopped that giving such approvals wherever they see a co-investment class, and it's a discussion point now. We understand there is a lobbying going on and there's a discussion going on with SEBI to permit, purely because of efficiencies that one can get of having that flexibility where the co-investor can be issued a co-investment class within the AI structure. And again, this could become potentially a kind of an exception to the blind pool to some extent. But as of now, as things stand today, SEBI is not happy with having a co-investment class baked into the PPM. The only methodology then available to a co-investor is either he comes directly if it's a corporate, or if there are one or two co-investors, then you set up a separate vehicle, either it's like a private trust or a private LLP to that extent. But then there are other challenges in terms of how the manager is going to get its carry and how the manager is going to charge its management fee. But there are way arounds there, and I think it's complicated to talk about it on this forum here right now. But going forward, key issues under Category 3F. Now, as I said, there was a time where Category 3IF could either be an open-ended registration or a closed-ended registration, which means that if at the time of registration of Category 3IF, if it was registered as an open-ended, then the only open-ended schemes could be launched and closed-ended schemes could not be launched. But we have seen the change in stance from SEBI in the last few months, where SEBI is now warm to the idea and actually has approved both closed-ended schemes as well as open-ended schemes under the same AIF license. Another debate is that whether a Category 3F, which is more into listed space, and they can afford, especially the open-ended funds, they can afford you can say periodic redemptions or exit options. Why can't that not be offered even to a closed-ended fund, given that there is liquidity? Now, since regulations say that the tenure of a closed-ended fund should at least be 3 years, generally the practice is to see that after 3 years of the fund's term only you allow a redemption option and not ahead. And this is managed by way of ensuring that you have enough of lock-in periods to discourage any early redemption by the investors. Another sort of gray area is where you have, say, 100% ownership and control of the manager or the sponsor entity with a foreign investor or a foreign owner, foreign shareholder. And the Category 3 IF is being managed by them. Whether there are any norms to be complied under the FEMA regulations, it's not very clear whether such AIF has to only comply with the FPI limitation, whereby a Category 3 IF is limited to invest only in those type of securities where an FPI can make investment, or even the FDI norms come into play. For example, where if such a Category 3 IF wants to buy, let's say, a stock of ITC Limited, maybe because it's into tobacco. Tobacco as a sector is not allowed for investment, right? It is not allowed for investment from FDI point of view. So clearly, from that point of view, the manager may have a good inclination to invest in ITC, but because of this gray area, whether that such a fund can make investment in such type of sectors or companies is kind of questionable. Category 3 AIF, we have talked about this earlier on. The basic thing is that you have to make sure that it is a significant portion, 50.1% of the corpus of Category 2 AIF has to be into unlisted security. The rest of it can technically be into listed security. This has been a new not new development. It has been evolving kind of a thing that you can set up a AIF in Gift City. There are challenges around it, and it's not that you can't overcome them. But yeah, if you are sitting here in India and wanting to launch an AIF in Gift City, then there are certain nuances that one has to think about. I think the significant being, obtaining RBI approval, which takes a good amount of time. If you are acting as a sponsor sitting in India, then you have to go to RBI, take their prior approval before you can act as a sponsor. And there's a whole host of things which I think are way beyond the time proposed for this session. So I'll not dwell deep, but I'm just touching upon this that yes, this is also another possibility for people to think of when they are looking at setting up an AIF. 100% FDI is allowed across all the three categories. I talked to you about ownership and control of the manager and sponsor. If that is the case, then the downstream norms, FDI norms, will be applicable for the AIF. The extent of foreign investment in the AIF per se is not a determinative factor here. So you can have 100% of the AIF corpus being invested by foreign investors. But as long as your manager and your sponsor entity is owned and controlled by Indian residents, you are the AIF is not required to comply with the FDI policy at all. Only where your sponsor or your manager entity is owned and controlled by non-Indian residents is where the question for the AIF to follow downstream FDI norms come into play. So obviously, when you talk about downstream investment by the AIF, whole host of things come into play, like sectoral norms, the reporting, the valuation. All these things will be applicable to the AIF if the AIF's manager and sponsor is owned and controlled by non-Indian residents. Now, these are the key contractual provisions. I think one can just quickly go through this, given the time paucity. I've taken a good amount of time in the earlier slides, but I think these are some of these points which are also now coming as standard pointers as part of the PPM, because SEBI, as I said, last year come out with the standardized template for PPM, and most of these are accepted points as part of the PPM. And also these become quite a few of these become discussion points between LPs in terms of if they're coming with a significant ticket size, then these become discussion points, and they are obviously either baked into the contribution agreement, or they become part of a side letter, or they become a general term of the PPM available to all. I think they're quite self-explanatory, so I'm not delving into each of them separately, but I'm just putting it on the screen for the sake of completeness. Now, again, here, one of the crucial points is warehousing. Now, we have seen, given the time that SEBI takes to approve AIF, we have seen urgencies purely from an investment point of view that the manager and sponsor, they want to, warehouse investment. So that is permissible. As long as you make it known to the investors in the PPM that there will be some warehoused investments which will be brought into the fold of the fund after the first closing of the fund that way. And you may not need to disclose the companies right away purely from a confidentiality point of view till that investor is signing the contribution agreement, but post that you would have to. SEBI is also wanting the managers to detail as to at what cost these investments will be brought into the fund. And there are various methodologies around it. For example, it could be the hurdle rate of return at maximum, I mean to say. So it's up to the hurdle rate of return that could be the cost, or it could be an X percentage you can mention, or you could mention the valuation that will be carried out by two valuers, and a mean of that would be the cost. So there are various methodologies, but this detailing is required from SEBI point of view. Another point is that associate entities. Now, associate entity is broadly defined to mean any entity where 15% or more is owned by the directors of by the manager, sponsor, trustee, or the respective directors. Now the question here is that whether you can take a one-time approval for throughout the term of the fund, or for each of the investment that is proposed in an associate entity, you have to actually approach and take approval of the investors, because without that you can't make, the AIF cannot make investment into associate entities. There have been mixed, you can say, approaches to this. And both of them are fine as long as I think you make it known to the investor that he is either consenting like a one-time consent, or he's actually consenting to a particular investment that has been proposed, because there is no stipulation on this in the regulations per se. So it's left to the manager and what's comfortable from investors' point of view. Ability to launch successor fund, now purely from dedication of time and effort. This is another discussion point with the LPs. They would expect that a certain threshold of the fund's corpus is invested. Usually it is, a norm is 70% or thereabouts, whereby once that has been invested or deployed by the fund, is at which point in time the manager or the sponsor can look at launching a second scheme or second AIF. So AIF regime can be considered an alternative to FDI regime. As I said, that as long as your sponsor and manager are Indian controlled, Indian owned and controlled, and the 100% of the corpus can be comprised of foreign investors, which means that you have onshore FDI vehicle in a way, which is being managed by a local manager. Similarly for FPI as well as for the ECB regime, because under the FPI regime, as you know, there are certain norms in terms of how much of investments can happen in liquid instruments, how much of investment can happen in short term instruments, how much of investment can happen in corporate debt, and all. There are limits to it. You are only subject to the headroom availability, and FPI can make these investments. But that is not the case if the overseas pooling structure. It could be a feeder fund, for example, which is investing into the AIF in India, and that AIF can be comprised, as I said, of 100% foreign investors, and that thereby there is a bit of arbitrage to that extent. Similarly, purely from an ECB regime point of view, there are, as you may know, under the external commercial borrowings regime, there are norms with regard to class of lenders, end use restrictions, and the limit on the interest that can be paid. No such limit applies per se to the AIF. So AIFs are free to determine how much of coupon is to be paid on a particular transaction. Again, AIF regime can be an alternative to FPI regime purely because it gets a QIB status that way. And whatever monies are being invested through the category 3 AIF, so to speak, can be repatriable 100%, right? And subject to the tax nuances, which obviously tax advisors are best to advise on, you can have 100% of an AIF being invested into by FDI investors and have an onshore FPI structure, so to speak. Now, these are some of those informal guidances that I've just thrown on the screen right now, which gives you some idea in terms of the thinking of SEBI on the policy front. For Singular, there was this question whether you can launch an open-ended scheme and closed-ended scheme, but that has now been kind of it's a non-issue now because SEBI has started allowing. On the Brookfield, Peninsula Brookfield, the issue was whether offshore, because of the holding structure of Brookfield entity, they had a number of associates outside of India. And purely from a disciplinary history point of view, SEBI requires disciplinary history of all the associates also to be mentioned in the PPM. So the question was whether they should mention about such significant number of the associates, or only the associates which are involved in the AIF business in India. The answer from SEBI was that all the associates offshore details have to be given in the PPM. The 25% investment limit must be maintained throughout the life cycle of the fund or the scheme. That was the mandate from SEBI. But here again, the question is whether you have to maintain this limit at the time of making investment, or you have to look at the corpus, because you may be doing closings, or you may be raising funds over a period of time by holding multiple closings. So the best approach would be to maintain this 25% at each closing, because you have the corpus, you know what the capital commitments you have raised. So purely from complying with the letter of law, 25% should be of what you have raised and not what the target corpus could be. Because you may or may not raise the target corpus, and if you fail to raise the target corpus, you may play foul of this 25% norm. Again, there was a clarity given by SEBI on the temporary investments, where SEBI clearly gave a clarity that, look, you can park your monies in the fund that you have received, not just at the time when the monies are pending deployment, but also at the time when they're pending distribution, because there could be a time lag between the fund receiving distribution proceeds because of divestments and redemptions of the portfolio entities or the securities. But there may be some calculations to be done at the AIF level, and immediately money cannot be paid out to the investor. So for that much time period, SEBI has given clarity that you can park these monies again in temporary investments or temporary securities. Yeah, I think that's about it from my end. I've tried to manage it within the time given for the session. I'm happy to take any questions at this point.
Thank you so much, Sunit. Audience, if you have any questions, there's a ask question tab on the you will find on your screen. You can just quickly put your questions there. We have a few minutes to go, so if you can quickly share your questions on the ask question tab. So, Sunit, till we get some questions from the audience. Hello.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So I'll go ahead with one. So,
sure.
what are the new? What are in your experience? What are the top challenges usually the new funds face? Someone who's setting up an AIF today. What are the pitfalls to avoid for speedier approvals?
Yeah, so as I said, if you in the investment committee, if you are looking at onboarding any external member, and that external member is not a resident Indian citizen, then it is best not to onboard such a member of the IC, because otherwise SEBI is not likely to process the application. And the other key other key point to be noted here is the SEBI scrutiny on the key person. SEBI is very sensitive on the key person who is being projected and whether he is actually complying with the requirement of both the track record as well as the qualification norm. So one has to be very careful in terms of whom they are presenting, and that person is able to meet or not with the requirement. That assessment has to be done earlier on, so that there's enough of clarity there. And obviously the basic thing would be that since it's already out, the CB PPM format is already out, one has to be very critical about the fact that whether whatever your wish list in terms of the terms of the PPM are designed to match with what SEBI has come out with the standardized terms for the PPM. Then that has to be kind of achieved before you make an application to SEBI.
Sure. So the next question we have is for pooling vehicles, which international geographies are most used? How is Gift City emerging in this space?
Yeah, so Gift City is definitely emerging because, as I said, there are definitely norms that are laid down for setting up an AIF in Gift City. But if you are looking at sponsoring an AIF in Gift City, it's taking a bit of a time, and that time could be anywhere between 3 to 4 or 5 months. It's very difficult to put that timeline because it requires RBI approval. And there are nuances also from tax point of view, which I'm not qualified to speak, but this is our discussions with Big Fours on various client matters. We understand there are tax nuances which is holding back large scale such AIF setups being happening from Gift City. But definitely from in times to come, we will see a good amount of feeder funds or even plain vanilla funds, AIF setups being happening through Gift City. Right now, if other than Gift City, I have to look at, then Mauritius continues to be the favorite jurisdiction. If not Mauritius, then Cayman can be considered, and if not Cayman, then even Singapore, because in Singapore, as people may know, there is this new legal form which is called VCC structure, whereby you can set up, or you can. There are also platforms available who make you available a particular cell, and you can use that cell for making investments into India in an Indian AIF. So yeah, that's what my answer is.
Sure. Thank you. So, audience, due to paucity of time, we'll be able to, at the max, cover two more questions. So, please quickly send yours. In the meanwhile, Sunit, here's the next question for you. Uh, is the AIF segment coming out as an alternative source of capital raising for companies? Since asset classes like private credit, real estate, etc., are coming under it, what, as per you, will benefit the investors? Will categories of risk like in MFs also get introduced here?
Well, highly unlikely to happen, because then what will happen is that will kind of not serve the purpose for the AIF arena. AIF is catering to a certain type of investor class. That's the reason why we have the higher ticket size, which is not the case in mutual fund. For mutual fund, the biggest thing is corporate governance and also liquidity. but these two aspects are missing so far as bringing these things in the mutual fund space. So to my mind, at least to in time in the the in time to come, in short time, I think I don't see that coming through, but maybe who knows, many years down the line that may become a reality as another investment avenue for mutual funds. But as of now, I think yes, AIF definitely is an alternative source of finance. I would say in today's scenario, definitely a savior, because as I said earlier on, banks and NBFCs are facing whatever issues they are facing in their respective domains. Therefore, AIF definitely is an alternative source of finance, clearly.
Uh, okay, just a sec. Talking about the next question, I think you spoke of ITC. So, a question here from a fund manager who's about investment in ESG category, and how can this be brought into the PPM when, especially when benchmarking and methodology is still evolving in this space.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question actually, because as I said, this is an evolving space. ESG is also now catching up in AIF space, and we are seeing this being as an ask coming from many of the fund managers and sponsors, because they obviously are being nudged by their respective investors. They see this will increase their marketability. Um, as of now, see, there is no, and it's like it's a voluntary thing at the end of the day. It's not like imposed by the regulator. So as long as it's going to increase your marketability, it's going to gel with your strategy. It is not going to limit your manager's ability to navigate whatever commercial objectives he wants to achieve. To my mind, I think to each his own. Honestly, ESG is not something that you have to confront basis certain principles or something. It's something what you define as ESG and you bake it in your PPM. Okay, these are the principles as a manager you think you are going to follow in the ESG arena. I think you can drive it that way, to my mind. And given the specific example of ITC and all, I think it's very selective. I just actually bounce that off purely from the point of view of driving a point on another issue whereby there are FDI prohibitions in that sector. But yes, I agree with you, because Category 3 IF can also have an ESG framework of its own, and they can define what are the prohibited sectors for the IF when they talk about ESG in that context.
Okay. The next question, for the follow-on fund permission by regulator, what is the governance requirements or something which investors should look into, especially since these funds can be used as tool for supporting valuations of the preceding fund?
Yeah, so that's absolutely doable. Now you can have a successor scheme that also looks to invest or make follow-on investments in the portfolio of the first fund. Nothing stops you from doing that. It's, I think, detailing it out in your strategy that the purpose of this fund could be to invest X amount of its corpus in the earlier fund's portfolio entities, and what checks and balances you think you can mention to give comfort to the reader of the PPM. I think it's doable. It's not a prohibitive thing. It's just about you detailing it out and making it known to the investor and being transparent about it, right? And if any higher level of diligence is required at the IC level, or even from a purely from a valuation point of view, maybe you may have two valuers who value the portfolio companies of the first scheme, which is being considered for the second scheme, and a mean of that could be the price at which you make the investment. So I think yes, there are ways in which you can tackle them, but it's not prohibitive. You can manage it.
Sure. So last two quick questions, Sunit. One is, someone asking is, if it says that AIF cannot give loans, but then we have so many AIFs that follow a debt strategy or a credit strategy. So what's the difference or the nuances around to marry these two statements? The question is in connection to a category 2 AIF.
Yeah, yeah. No, so this is very simple there. When I say loan, it's a loan if someone, an AIF is giving a loan, which just means that money going out of the bank account of the AIF and which is receivable with X coupon amount. That's what loan constitutes. But when we talk about in the context of a loan which is backed by a security, which is a debenture security, could be an OCD or NCD, whatever form and shape it could be, then it is permissible. Now that SEBI has allowed clearly. Loan, pure play loan is something that is a domain of RBI and it's only for NBFCs and banks. Purely from bringing out that distinction, SEBI has clearly said that, look, we cannot be answerable. I mean, we cannot permit AIFs to give loans because that's a domain of RBI to manage and to supervise. And that's purely from that point of view. You can structure the loan by way of issuing a debenture security that is permissible.
All right. So the last question, can you please discuss AIF versus PMS in brief?
Well, AIF versus PMS. Yes, I think the broad, features that I can just throw up on this platform is, one is that you can have a depool structure for PMS, right? Because PMS is a one-to-one kind of a relationship. So each client is having his own demat account that is managed by the portfolio manager based on the power of attorney. But category 3 IF, you can't have this kind of distinction. It has to be a blind pool. So whatever NAV reflects the performance of the entire security or the basket of securities across the board that the AIF is holding, which is not the case for PMS. Now, in PMS, you may not be able to leveraging, right? But that is something you are allowed to do in the AIF. Again, in PMS, you are not as a sponsor required to put in any money, but in a category 3 IF, you are required to put, a 10%, 5% or 10 crore, whichever is a lower amount as skin in the game. So these are nuances, and you can actually run a category 3 IF like an open-ended or closed-ended structure. But PMS, from a scalability point of view, is limited because how much of clients can you onboard? I mean, you talk about big institutions, definitely they will be having good number of team members to manage clientele, but beyond a point it is not a scalable kind of animal. But category 3 f definitely is subject to obviously 1,000 investor limit that a AIF can have.